The New York Skyline restaurant glittered with chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations, each table set with polished silverware, reflecting the glow of 1,000 candles. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided silently across the marble floor, balancing trays with elegance, while the low hum of jazz swirled through the air. Elena Ruiz sat by the grand window overlooking the Hudson River, her red dress wrapped around her like armor, her dark hair pinned carefully, her lipstick chosen after 20 minutes of indecision. She wanted tonight to feel different, to feel like proof that she could belong in a world where words were often her enemy. She had rehearsed her smile in the mirror, practiced speaking clearly, so her lips would form each syllable without betraying nerves. She checked her phone again. 10 minutes late. 15, 20. Perhaps traffic. She told herself to wait because this mattered. Blind dates were terrifying, but she had dared to hope. Hope that maybe someone would see her not as incomplete, not as a burden, but as Elena. 24 years old, intelligent, working at a community library, surviving every challenge that had tried to silence her. A man finally appeared, tall, lean, dressed in a suit that seemed sharp until you noticed the crooked tie and the arrogance in the way he carried himself. Elena rose slightly, her practiced smile ready, her voice soft but steady. As she extended her hand and said hello, his eyes flicked down, caught the glint of her hearing aids. For a fraction of a second he froze, then his smile warped into something crueler. His words dropped into the polished air like shards of glass. "I did not know you were actually deaf." The nearby tables stirred, a subtle hush falling over the music. Elena felt her stomach lurch, but she steadied her breathing. "I mentioned in my profile that I have hearing loss," she answered, keeping her tone calm. The man scoffed. "Hearing difficulties, that is what you wrote." "I thought it meant sometimes you ask people to repeat themselves." "I did not think it meant this, handicapped." The word echoed, cold, ugly. Her chest burned. She wanted to stand to leave, but her legs refused. The red dress that had given her confidence now felt like a spotlight, exposing her humiliation. He leaned back with disdain, pulling out his phone, scrolling as if she no longer existed. "Look, this is not what I signed up for. Do you know how exhausting it would be to always repeat things for you? Imagine trying to go out with my friends, having to explain that my girlfriend cannot even hear properly. No offense, but I have standards. No offense." Elena gripped her water glass so tightly her knuckles whitened. She would not cry, not here, not now. She told herself she was more than his words. She was not broken, she was not less, but the sting cut deep, too deep to deny. At a corner table, a man lowered his glass of whiskey. Damien Blackwood had not come here to rescue anyone. He had come to disappear into the shadows of luxury. He owned a billionaire who wore power like another tailored suit, known across New York as cold, ruthless, unreachable. But the moment he had seen Elena, sitting alone, nervous but radiant in her red dress, he had looked closer. He had noticed the late arrival, the arrogant body language, the tightening of her smile. And when the man uttered that word, handicapped, Damien's jaw had clenched with fury that did not belong to a stranger. He rose slowly, deliberately, his chair scraping softly against the marble. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The cruel man, still smirking at his phone, did not notice, but Elena did. Her heart hammered as Damien approached. She braced for another blow, another stranger's judgment. Instead, the billionaire lifted his hands. His movements were deliberate, fluid, every gesture practiced, every pause meaningful. His eyes locked with hers as his fingers spoke the silent language she thought no one in this room would understand. "You deserve better?" Time stopped. Elena blinked, her breath caught. Her mind scrambled to comprehend what she had seen. This was Damian Blackwood, whose face had graced Forbes magazine, whose fortune was whispered in billions, whose icy reputation made even Wall Street tremble. And yet he had just signed to her in her language words she had needed more desperately than she had ever admitted. Around them, the restaurant waited silent witnesses to a moment that shifted everything. Elna felt the sting of humiliation fade, just slightly replaced by shock and an unfamiliar spark of hope. Who was this man, and why did he care? Elena sat frozen long after. The man who had so casually discarded her pushed his chair back and left with a smirk. The restaurant gradually resumed its hum of voices and music. But for her, the echo of that single word, handicapped, had not faded. It clung to her skin, heavier than the stares she felt, prickling from strangers who had witnessed her humiliation. She lowered her gaze, unwilling to meet their pity. The water in her glass rippled as her hand trembled. She thought of leaving, of gathering her bag and vanishing into the rain, but her body refused to obey. She was not weak, she reminded herself, but nights like this made her question how much more she could endure. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, pulling her into the long thread of memory that had shaped who she was. Elena had grown up in Queens in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of cumin and garlic, the scents her mother carried from her Mexican heritage. Her father worked as a janitor in a mid-town office building, taking double shifts to keep food on the table. When Elena was 4, an infection damaged her hearing permanently. Doctors explained it in words too complicated for a child, but the outcome was simple. She would never hear the world as others did again. She was fitted with hearing aids bulky at the time, drawing curious glances wherever she went. At school, children pointed, laughed, shouted words they knew she could not catch. Teachers tried to help, but often gave up when she fell behind in noisy classrooms. The loneliness of silence weighed heavily, and yet she learned resilience. She learned to read lips, to watch faces carefully, to anticipate meaning from context. She excelled at reading and writing because books did not mock her. They welcomed her into their quiet world, where she could lose herself in stories that did not care if she heard every word aloud. Her parents fought often about money, about the cost of therapies, but her mother always told her in Spanish that she was strong, that she was whole. Elena clung to those words through adolescence, when friendships were fragile and dates non-existent. Boys whispered that she was pretty, but strange, that her machines made them uncomfortable. She pretended not to care, but every dismissal carved a scar she carried into adulthood. By 24, she had accepted that romance might never come easily, yet she refused to stop trying. Working at the community library gave her purpose. She loved organizing shelves, recommending novels to children, hosting story hours, where she signed alongside reading so that deaf kids could see themselves in her. Still, the evenings were long. Her apartment too quiet, the silence pressing against her chest. That was why she had joined the dating app. That was why she had said yes to the man who had seemed witty in his messages, who had called her eyes beautiful, who had insisted he wanted to meet. She had chosen this restaurant despite its price, because she wanted to feel like she belonged even if, for just one night. And now here she sat, her courage shattered, in front of a room full of strangers. The humiliation burned more deeply because she had dared to hope. Across the room, Damien Blackwood still watched. Elena felt his presence, though she could not bring herself to look directly at him again. His intervention had surprised her, the silent message, "You deserve better," lingering in her chest like an ember refusing to die. But why had he done it? He was a man from a different world, a name she had seen in newspapers, attached to billion-dollar deals. A face she had glimpsed once on a magazine cover in the library. He was not supposed to notice her, much less speak, in the language that had so often isolated her. Yet he had. And that unsettled her more than the cruelty of her date. She picked at the edge of her napkin, memory bleeding into the present, the sting of adolescence returning, the playground chants, the college parties where she was never invited, the professors who praised her essays, but never looked her in the eye when she asked a question. Life had been a series of rejections dressed in different clothes. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight had been her attempt to step into something new. Instead, it had become another story of rejection, crueler only because it had unfolded in public. The words handicapped and standards swirled like poison. She imagined the man texting his friends, now mocking her, turning her into a cruel joke. Her face heated with shame. She wondered why she kept trying, why she exposed herself to pain again and again. Was loneliness worse than humiliation? Perhaps, but loneliness at least could be hidden. Tonight would follow her home, like an unwanted shadow. Yet a flicker of something resisted despair. The billionaire's hands had moved with certainty, his eyes steady, his presence unshaken by the ridicule. "You deserve better." It was such a simple phrase, yet no one had ever said it to her in a way that felt true. No teacher, no classmate, no man she had tried timidly to trust. And that paradox carved confusion into her thoughts. Why should a stranger, a man of unimaginable wealth and distance, see her worth when those closest to her had not? Damien returned to his seat, his expression unreadable, but Elena's mind refused to let go of the image. She forced herself to breathe, counting the seconds as she had learned in therapy to calm the panic. She straightened her back, refusing to crumble entirely. If he had seen her, if he had spoken those words, then perhaps the universe was not entirely against her. But she would not let herself believe too much. Belief had burned her before. The waiter approached quietly and asked if she wanted to order. Her throat tightened, but she nodded, unwilling to flee in defeat. She ordered pasta she knew she would barely touch, just to stay long enough to reclaim some dignity. She did not realize that across the room, Damien had already made a decision. For now, though, Elena sat alone with her memories, her humiliation, and the faintest spark of something she could not yet name, something rising quietly from the ashes of rejection. Damien Blackwood was not the type of man who interfered in the lives of strangers. His empire had been built on ruthless focus and cold precision, on ignoring distractions that pulled lesser men off course. Yet as he sat at his corner table, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his attention refused to drift away from the young woman in red who had just been publicly humiliated. He had seen cruelty in boardrooms, in families clawing at his fortune, in tabloids that feasted on lies, but this cruelty felt different. It echoed too closely to a memory he had buried, one that still clawed at him in quiet hours. Elena Ruiz sat stiffly, her chin lifted in fragile defiance, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Damien recognized that posture. It was the look of someone who refused to collapse, even when the world shoved them down. He remembered that look on his younger brother's face when classmates sneered at his silence. The thought made his chest ache with an old guilt that had never loosened its grip. The cruel man who had abandoned Elena was gone, leaving only a foul taste in the air and the whispers of other diners. Damien could have left it there. He could have finished his drink, paid his bill, and disappeared back into the night like he always did. But something in the way Elena sat gripping her napkin as if it were a lifeline compelled him to rise. He did not move with haste. His power had never needed haste. He crossed the room with deliberate grace, and conversation hushed again as people realized who he was. Some recognized the billionaire immediately, their eyes widening others, only sensed the weight of his presence. Elena glanced up, and for a moment panic flickered across her face. She expected more ridicule, perhaps another cruel remark, disguised as pity. But instead, Damien stopped at her table, his towering frame, casting a shadow over the delicate candles. He signed carefully, his hands moving with practiced precision. "May I sit?" Elena blinked, shock widening her eyes. She nodded without finding her voice. Damien lowered himself into the empty chair across from her, signaling the waiter with a subtle glance. Within moments, another glass was set before him, another napkin unfolded, as if the staff had been waiting for this inevitability. Elena's heart thundered. She had seen this man before, though only in photographs. Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Business Insider. Damien Blackwood, the untouchable billionaire, the man rumored to have turned his father's crumbling company into a fortress of steel and finance. What was he doing here at her table? Why was he speaking her language? The silence between them was fragile but not uncomfortable. Damien studied her with eyes as dark as obsidian, steady, unwavering. "You should not let his words define you," he signed with measured movements. "He is a fool." Elena swallowed her hands, trembling slightly as she signed back. "You know sign language?" Damien inclined his head once, enough to have this conversation. Her curiosity edged past her humiliation. Why? Why would a man like him take the time to learn, much less use it with her? Damien lifted his glass, taking a slow sip before answering aloud. This time his voice deep, controlled. "It matters to me." That was all he gave, and yet something in the way he said it told her there was more. Elna struggled to process. The billionaire's sudden presence drew attention from every corner of the restaurant. Whispers grew louder, phones discreetly raised. She felt exposed but strangely safe at the same time. Damien radiated a calm authority that shielded her from the lingering humiliation. Still, she could not shake her doubts. "Why are you here?" she signed hesitantly. "What do you want from me?" Damien leaned forward slightly enough for his words to feel intimate, though his tone remained steady. "To remind you that you deserve more than what he gave. Nothing more." The simplicity of the answer disarmed her. Men in her past had always wanted something, even if it was only the satisfaction of mocking. But this man, this billionaire with the world at his fingertips, claimed he wanted nothing. That terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. The waiter arrived with Damien's order, without even being asked. A steak seared perfectly, rare sides, arranged with artistry. He gestured for Elena to eat, but her appetite was gone. Instead, she sipped water, watching him with quiet suspicion and growing intrigue. The weight of his reputation pressed in on her. She had read the stories, the speculation about his cold heart, his ruthless negotiations, the way he never smiled in public. And yet here he was signing to a stranger, offering kindness where no one else had. What kind of man was he, really? Damien cut his steak with elegant precision, as though even eating was an act of control. Between bites he signed again. "You are a librarian. I have seen you before." At the East Side Community Library. Elena flushed. "Yes, I work there." "How did you know?" "My foundation funds programs for accessibility." "I review reports. Your name appeared." He spoke it plainly as though it were obvious, but Elena felt the ground shift beneath her. Of all the people in New York, he had not stumbled across her by accident. He had known her name already. The realization left her unsettled. So this was not a coincidence. Damien seemed to read her unease. His gaze softened minutely, almost imperceptible, but Elena noticed. "Do not mistake my awareness for intrusion," he said quietly. "I value those who fight for what matters. You matter." The words pressed against the walls she had built around herself. She wanted to reject them, to dismiss this as pity, but his tone carried no pity, only certainty. The evening stretched, and slowly, Elena's tension eased. The humiliation of earlier still lingered, but Damien's presence dulled its sting. He did not force conversation. He allowed silences to breathe, speaking when necessary, signing when appropriate. His patience unnerved her because she was used to people rushing, mocking, or abandoning. Here was a man with empires at his command, yet he sat across from her as if nothing else demanded his time. When at last she gathered courage, she asked softly, "Why are you doing this?" Damien's expression flickered with something she could not name, sorrow perhaps, or memory. "Because I have seen this before," he signed, "and I will not sit idle again." Elena wanted to press, to ask what he meant, but the gravity in his eyes silenced her. She sensed a story behind his restraint, one that would not be told tonight. For now she accepted the strange comfort of his company. Around them the restaurant resumed its rhythm, but for Elena the night had already shifted. She had come expecting rejection. She had endured cruelty. Yet somehow she now sat across from a billionaire who spoke her language and insisted she deserved better. Hope was a dangerous thing, she knew, but it flickered nonetheless, fragile and real. Elena left the restaurant that night, still shaken, though the bitterness of humiliation had been dulled by something she could not quite explain. Damien Blackwood had not pressed for her number, had not demanded anything at all. Yet his presence lingered like an echo. The way he had looked at her steady and unflinching unsettled her long after she had stepped into the cold rain of Manhattan. She told herself not to think of him again, not to let a billionaire occupy her thoughts, but memory is a stubborn guest, and his hands shaping words in sign language would not leave her mind. Days passed, and Elena buried herself in work at the library. The shelves of books had always been her sanctuary, and she lost herself in the quiet order of categorizing, of helping children find adventure within pages. Yet one morning when the sun cut through the tall windows and scattered across the tables, a ripple of unease moved through the staff. A man had arrived. His height, his sharp suit, and the effortless authority of his presence sent whispers down every aisle. Damien Blackwood was walking into her world, and Elena nearly dropped the stack of novels in her arms when she saw him. Why was he here? Why now? He approached the circulation desk with the composure of someone who never asked permission to exist. Elena stood frozen, her palms sweating, until he lifted his hands and signed with deliberate calm. "Good morning." Elena stared, unable to find her voice. "What are you doing here?" She finally signed back, her movements quick with nerves. Damien's lips curved almost imperceptibly. "My foundation funds this library. We sponsor programs for children with hearing loss. I came to see them." The words hit her like a revelation. She remembered vaguely seeing the Blackwood Foundation logo on flyers, but had never connected it to him personally. "You came because of that?" she asked, skeptical. Damien inclined his head. "I came because this matters." His tone was even, but beneath it, she sensed something deeper, something personal. He did not look at the rows of books or the busy parents shepherding children. His gaze remained fixed on her, as if she alone were the reason for his visit. Elena tried to compose herself, tried to bury the rush of emotion under logic. But the memory of his intervention at the restaurant, and now this unexpected appearance, began weaving threads she could not ignore. Later that afternoon, she found herself leading a small group of children in story hour reading aloud while signing at the same time. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Damien standing at the back, silent watching. When she signed a word incorrectly, one of the children corrected her with a giggle, and Elena laughed, repeating the sign properly. The room filled with a joy that transcended language. For the first time, she saw Damien's expression shift, a shadow of grief flickering before he masked it again. After the children left, Elena gathered her books and turned to find him waiting. "You know sign language well," she said carefully, "both speaking and signing. How long have you studied?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he answered, 3 years. Elena tilted her head. Why? It was not idle curiosity. She needed to understand why a man like him would devote time to something most people ignored. Damien exhaled slowly, as though he had known this question would come. "I had a younger brother," he said at last, his voice lower than usual. "His name was Adrian. He was born deaf. I learned sign language to talk with him." For a moment, Damien's mask slipped, and Elena glimpsed a vulnerability that contradicted every headline about his ruthless ambition. "What happened to him?" she asked softly, her hands faltering in midair. Damien's gaze dropped, shadows gathering in his eyes. "He died in an accident when he was 14. I was 18. I was supposed to be watching him." The guilt in his voice was raw, unpolished, and Elena felt her chest tighten. She had not expected this answer, not expected the billionaire to bleed memories so openly. "I am sorry," she whispered both, with her voice and her hands. He met her gaze, then steady but fractured. "I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes. When I saw you at that restaurant, when I saw him humiliate you, it was like I was watching Adrian again. Silent, alone. I could not let it happen." His confession pressed against the silence like a storm, heavy with grief and unspoken regret. Elena felt her own defenses softening. She understood what it meant to carry the weight of being different, to endure cruelty. Because the world did not care to understand. Now she realized Damien carried his own weight too, the crushing burden of loss. Their connection was not pity, it was recognition. She lowered her hands, her throat tightening. "You stood up for me because you could not stand up for him," she signed gently. Damien did not answer immediately, but the flicker of pain in his eyes told her she was right. He finally gave a small nod, as though the truth no longer needed denial. Elena felt her heart pull in a direction she had not prepared for. This man, wrapped in wealth and reputation, was not unreachable. He was scarred, and scars recognized each other. They stood in the library's quiet, surrounded by shelves that had held her secrets for years. And in that moment, Elena understood that their stories were not as far apart as they seemed. She was poor and he was powerful, but both of them had been defined by silence, by loss, by the cruel indifference of others. That was the hidden connection, the thread that now tied them together in a way neither could ignore. Elena had never believed two worlds could exist so close together, yet feel so impossibly distant until the night she stepped into Damien Blackwood's sphere. He had invited her to a dinner at his penthouse after one of her library programs, insisting it was not a date, only a chance to discuss expanding the foundation's support for children with hearing loss. She had wanted to refuse, terrified of being swallowed whole by a world that had never been meant for her, but something in his steady eyes persuaded her otherwise. The elevator ride alone made her heart pound. The glass walls revealed the Manhattan skyline, glittering like a kingdom of stars beneath them. And when the doors opened, she entered a home unlike anything she had ever imagined. The penthouse stretched in sleek lines of steel and glass art pieces that belonged in museums adorning the walls, the faint scent of leather and aged wood mingling with the view of the city, sprawling endlessly below. Elena felt small, her thrift store heels clicking nervously against marble that gleamed like water. Damien moved through the space with the ease of a man who had grown up in wealth. His suit jacket discarded now, but his presence still commanding. He gestured toward the dining area where a table had been set, for two not by accident, but by careful preparation. She sat stiffly afraid to touch anything, afraid to reveal how out of place she felt. She thought of her one-bedroom apartment in Queens, where the pipes rattled at night and the radiator barely worked in winter. Here every detail whispered of extravagance. A bottle of wine older than her life was opened without ceremony, and she wanted to laugh at the absurdity. How could her world of second-hand books and overdue rent connect with this? Damien noticed her hesitation, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "You are uncomfortable," he observed quietly. She lifted her chin, determined not to show weakness. "It is just different," she admitted. He studied her for a long moment before signing deliberately. "Different does not mean wrong." His words touched something in her, but still the gulf between them stretched wide. When the meal arrived, Elena found herself picking at the food dishes crafted like art flavors foreign to her tongue. Damien spoke of markets of negotiations in Dubai and Shanghai, of boardroom battles that decided the fate of billions. Elena listened politely, but felt the distance grow with every polished word. She could not imagine living in such a world where every move was measured in millions. When he asked about her work, she spoke with quiet passion about the children at the library, the way their faces lit up when they realized a story could be signed as well as read. For a moment, Damien's expression softened. He listened intently, asking questions not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. Still, Elena could not shake the awareness that she belonged to a smaller, humbler life, one that did not shine beneath chandeliers. As the evening wore on, she excused herself to the terrace, needing air. The city stretched below like a living map, cars glinting like fireflies, bridges glowing in arcs of light. She gripped the railing, wondering if she was foolish to even stand here, foolish to imagine anything lasting could emerge between them. Damien joined her silently, the night breeze tugging at his hair. He stood close, but not too close, his presence, a shield rather than a trap. "This is your world," she said softly, half aloud, half signing. "All of this, I do not belong here." Damien looked out over the city, his jaw tightening. "You think I belong?" he asked quietly. She turned to him, surprised. "Of course you do. You were born into this. You thrive in it." His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You see power and wealth. I see cages." Elena frowned. He continued, his voice lower, carrying the weight of truth. "My family built this empire, but it came with chains, expectations, deals made before I was born. A brother who needed protection I could not give. Do not mistake wealth for freedom." His words unsettled her. She had assumed his life was gilded, untroubled. Yet here he stood confessing it was as suffocating in its own way as her struggles. For the first time she glimpsed the cracks in his world, the loneliness carved by luxury. Still she shook her head. "You and I live in different realities." She signed, her fingers trembling. "People like me are mocked in restaurants. People like you are untouchable. How could we ever meet in the middle?" Damien's eyes burned with intensity. By choice. His answer was simple, yet it struck her harder than any lecture. Choice. He was saying that despite the distance, despite the wealth and poverty that divided them, he could choose to stand with her. But Elena's heart resisted. She had been disappointed too many times. She had learned that people always left when the weight of her difference became too heavy. Could a man like Damien truly mean what he said? The silence stretched between them, the city glowing below like an indifferent witness. She wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. Finally she whispered, "You cannot understand what it feels like to always be the one who does not fit." His gaze softened, and he signed slowly, deliberately. "You are wrong. I understand too well." And for a fleeting second she believed him. The gulf between their worlds remained vast, but somewhere in that night air, beneath the gaze of a city that thrived on contrast, a fragile bridge began to form. The following weeks unfolded like a slow and hesitant dance between two lives that had no reason to intertwine, yet somehow kept crossing paths. Elena told herself she should keep her distance, that billionaires did not belong in the quiet rhythms of libraries and community programs. But Damien Blackwood was not a man easily dismissed. His foundation had been quietly supporting the East Side Community Library for years, providing grants for new books, upgrading accessibility features, and sponsoring events that made the small building a rare haven for families who had nowhere else to go. She had always assumed those signatures on donation letters were nothing more than corporate formality. Now she understood there was a man behind them, a man who appeared at the library one crisp morning, with no entourage, wearing a simple charcoal coat that could not disguise his commanding presence. The staff scrambled with nervous energy, unsure how to host someone of his stature. But Damien waved away their attempts at ceremony. He was here, he explained, not for a photo opportunity, but to see the programs in action. Elena stood at the edge of the children's reading room, clutching a stack of brightly illustrated storybooks. When she saw him step inside, The children looked up in awe, whispering though they had no idea who he was beyond a tall stranger with serious eyes. Damien moved with unhurried patience, watching Elena as she arranged the circle of children on the rug. She began to read aloud, her voice gentle, while her hands signed each phrase. Some of the children mirrored her movements, eager to learn, their laughter filling the air. Damien watched silently, but Elena could sense the weight of his gaze, steady and unyielding. When the session ended, one boy tugged on her sleeve and pointed toward Damien. "Is he your friend?" the child asked. Elena faltered, glancing at Damien, who stood like a figure carved from marble. She smiled softly and signed to the boy. "He is someone who cares about this library." The boy nodded satisfied before running off. Damien approached, then his voice low but intent. "You are good at this." Elena shook her head, embarrassed. "I just love it. They need someone who understands." He studied her for a long moment. "And you do." That simple statement lingered between them, heavier than any compliment. From that day forward, Damien began appearing more often, though never in ways that felt intrusive. He attended board meetings of the Library Foundation, where Elena was often the only staff member invited. He asked questions not about profit margins or publicity, but about how many children were being reached, what resources they needed most, how sign language classes could expand. Elena saw a side of him no newspaper had ever described. A man who listened more than he spoke, whose authority was not only in his wealth, but in the way he gave attention to things others dismissed. Slowly, she allowed herself to lower her guard. He would sit quietly in a corner while she worked reviewing documents or sending curt replies to his endless emails, but his presence was strangely comforting. Sometimes he would bring coffee, always the exact way she preferred, after noticing once that she added more sugar than most. Other times he would ask her about the books she loved, and she found herself telling him about novels that had saved her through lonely years, stories of characters who fought to be seen. Damien listened with the same intensity he gave to billion-dollar deals, and that unnerved her more than anything. One evening after closing hours, Elena stayed late to sort through donated books. The lights cast long shadows across the aisles, and she was startled when Damien appeared in the doorway holding 2 takeout containers. "I thought you might not have eaten," he said simply. They sat at a small table between stacks of novels, sharing noodles from paper cartons like 2 ordinary people. For a moment, the differences between them faded. He told her about his travels, not in the polished tone of a public figure, but in anecdotes colored with exhaustion and small details he admitted he rarely shared. She told him about growing up in Queens, about her parents' sacrifices, about the loneliness of silence. At one point she laughed a sound she had almost forgotten she could produce so freely, and Damien stared as though the world had tilted. "That laugh," he said, "is rarer than anything in my collection." She blushed, deflecting, but the warmth of his gaze lingered. Days bled into weeks, and their bond grew in quiet ways. He accompanied her to a school event where children performed a play in both spoken word and sign language, and Elena noticed how his eyes softened when a little girl signed with clumsy hands, reminding him of his brother. She visited his office once, delivering materials for a literacy program, and felt the chill of marble floors and steel walls, only to find warmth in the way Damien paused his meeting to introduce her not as a staff member, but as someone integral to their mission. These moments built a fragile bridge between their worlds, and though Elena still feared its collapse, she could not deny the connection. Yet beneath it all lay an undercurrent of tension. She knew his reputation, the rumors of ruthless deals, the whispers of women who had tried and failed to melt his armor. She told herself she was different, not because she was special, but because she was ordinary, and that would never fit his life. Still, when his hand brushed hers one evening as they exchanged papers, she felt a current spark through her skin. He froze too, as if surprised, and for a heartbeat, their eyes locked in something that was not business, not charity, but undeniably human. Neither spoke of it, but both carried the moment silently. Their bond was growing fragile but undeniable, a seed pushing through stone. For a time, Elena allowed herself to believe that life had finally shifted, that the universe was no longer conspiring to remind her of everything she lacked. Damien's presence had become a steady rhythm, a quiet constant that softened the edges of her days. Yet every fragile happiness invites its shadow, and hers arrived one afternoon when a familiar face reappeared with malice sharpened like a blade. The man from her blind date, the one who had humiliated her so effortlessly, returned not with apologies but with venom. He had discovered who Damien was, had pieced together the whispers of the billionaire, seen with the poor deaf girl at a restaurant and later at the library. Fueled by arrogance and spite, he told his story to a gossip blog hungry for scandal. Within hours, headlines multiplied across the internet. Poor deaf girl hooks billionaire. Librarian seduces Blackwood. Gold digger in red dress. The cruelty was swift, merciless, and public. Elena first saw the articles when a coworker tried to hide her phone in panic. But the damage was already done. Images of her from the restaurant had surfaced, captured by someone's discreet camera. Her humiliation immortalized, and now twisted into a narrative she had no power to control. She sat in the library office, her body cold, her hands shaking, as she scrolled through comment sections dripping with scorn. Words like pathetic opportunist and freak leapt from the screen. She had endured cruelty in private all her life, but this was different. This was exposure mockery on a scale she had never imagined. Damien arrived at the library later that day. His expression stormed dark as he handed his phone to her. He had already seen the headlines, already summoned his legal team. But the fury in his eyes was not the fury of a businessman protecting his brand. It was the fury of a man watching someone he cared for be torn apart. Elena could not meet his gaze. Her shame was too heavy. I told you, she signed with trembling fingers. I do not belong in your world. This is what happens. Damien caught her hands mid-motion, steadying them with a grip that was firm but not harsh. This is not your fault, he said aloud, his voice low, controlled only by sheer force of will. This is mine to handle. But Elena shook her head, tears burning her eyes. No, it will destroy you too. The media will never let it go. I cannot let you pay the price for me. Damien's jaw tightened. Do you think I care about headlines? I have been the villain in every paper since I was 20. Let them write what they want. Elena pulled her hands free, her anguish spilling out. You do not understand. I have lived my whole life trying to be invisible so people would not laugh. And now the entire city is laughing. She turned away, hugging herself, the weight of 1,000 cruel eyes pressing against her skin. Damien stood behind her, silent for a long moment, before he spoke with a quietness that carried more power than any shout. "I understand more than you think." But his words did little to soothe her. In the days that followed, the scandal spread like wildfire. Paparazzi camped outside the library snapping photos of Elena as she tried to enter reporters, shouting questions she could not hear but could read from their lips. Children's parents began to whisper, worried that the library's reputation would be tainted. The board members grew nervous, muttering about damage control. Elena felt the ground she had built beneath her collapse. She considered resigning, disappearing back into anonymity, anything to escape the ridicule. Damien fought on another front meeting with lawyers, threatening lawsuits forcing publications to retract the most defamatory lies. But even his wealth could not erase the stain once it had been burned into public memory. The harder he fought, the more the media twisted the story, painting him as the ruthless billionaire, silencing the truth. It became a circus neither could control. One evening, when the library had finally emptied and she was alone, shelving books, Damien arrived unannounced. He stood in the aisle, his coat still damp from rain, his eyes filled with something she had not seen before: desperation. He signed slowly, his movements deliberate. "Do not let them take this from you. Do not let them win." Elena shook her head, her chest aching. "It is too late. They already have." Damien stepped closer, his voice raw. "Elena, listen to me. The world has always hated what it cannot understand. They hated my brother for his silence. They hate you for your strength. But they will not have the last word." She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to his conviction, but fear whispered louder. She imagined a future of constant harassment, her face plastered across tabloids, her dignity shredded again and again. She pulled back, tears streaking her cheeks. "I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot live like this." And in that moment, as he watched her retreat, Damien realized he was not only fighting the world outside, but the demons that lived within her, demons that had been fed for years by every rejection, every cruel word. He could battle the press, he could silence journalists with lawsuits, but he could not silence the voice inside her that believed she would never be enough. The past had returned, with claws bared, dragging both of them into a storm that threatened to tear apart the fragile bond they had begun to build. And for the first time in years, Damien felt powerless, not in business, but in the one place that mattered most, the fragile territory of a woman's heart. Damien had weathered hostile takeovers, betrayals by board members, and battles with men who would sell their souls for half his fortune. But nothing compared to the helplessness of watching Elena withdraw piece by piece into silence. She stopped answering his calls. At the library, she avoided him, slipping out of rooms the moment he entered. He knew it was not hatred that drove her retreat, but fear, a fear that his presence had dragged her into a spotlight she had never wanted. Still knowing did not ease the ache. Every night he stared at the Manhattan skyline from his penthouse windows, remembering the defiance in her eyes when she read to children, the quiet laugh she had shared over noodles, the way her hands moved with grace when she signed. He could not lose that, yet he felt her slipping away. One evening he finally cornered her in the staff office of the library. The place was empty shadows, stretching long as the city lights flickered through tall windows. Elena froze when she saw him. Her hands twitched as if ready to sign, but fell to her sides. Damien closed the door softly behind him, his voice low. "We need to talk." She shook her head, her chest rising sharply. There is nothing left to say. He stepped closer, his eyes hard but wounded. That is a lie. There is everything to say. Tell me why you are running from me. She finally met his gaze, and the pain in her eyes cut him deeper than any knife. Because I cannot live in your world. Because I will always be the girl they mock, the one they think is not enough. And being with you makes it worse. Damien clenched his fists, forcing his voice steady. Do you think I care what they say? She gave a bitter laugh. You do not have to care. You are untouchable. But me, I am the one who bleeds every time they print another headline. I am the one who cannot walk down the street without being stared at. Do you know what that feels like? For once, Damien did not answer immediately. He crossed the room slowly, then stopped just a few feet away. Yes. Her lips parted in disbelief. He signed deliberately, his movements firm. My brother. When he was alive, my own family treated him as a burden. My father told me once to stop wasting time on a boy who would never carry the Blackwood name with pride. I was 18 and I did nothing. I let my father's words silence me. The night Adrian died, I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to protect him. I failed. His voice cracked, then the mask slipping as years of guilt poured through. I have carried that weight every day since, so do not tell me I do not know what it feels like to be mocked, to be dismissed, to watch the world tear apart someone you love because of something they could not control. Elena's throat tightened. She had never seen him like this, raw, unguarded. She felt his pain, like it was her own. But even as tears stung her eyes, fear held her back. That is exactly why she whispered, because I will never be strong enough to carry both our scars. You deserve someone whole, someone who can stand at your side without trembling every time the world looks. Damien shook his head fiercely, his voice rising. No, what I deserve is the woman who stood in that restaurant and refused to bow her head. The woman who teaches children to sign when the world tells them they cannot belong. The woman who makes me remember that strength is not measured in billions, but in survival. You are that woman, Elena. She turned away, hugging herself, her tears falling freely. But what if I cannot be enough for you? What if my silence is too much? He closed the distance between them, then his hand hovering just inches from her arm, not daring to touch without her permission. Your silence, he said softly, is the only sound I have wanted to hear since the night I met you. Her heart lurched, but the fear still screamed. She pulled back, shaking her head. I cannot, not now. She grabbed her bag and slipped past him. Her steps hurried, her sobs barely contained. Damien let her go, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. For the first time in years, he felt utterly defeated, not by rivals or markets, but by the one person who mattered. He slammed his hand against the desk, the sound echoing in the empty office, then sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The breaking point had come. She had pushed him away, convinced their worlds could never align. And though he told himself he would fight, that he would find a way back to her, a dark voice whispered in the silence that perhaps this was where their story ended. The charity gala had been scheduled months earlier, long before Damien ever walked into the Skyline restaurant and saw a young woman's world fracture under the weight of cruelty. It was meant to be another polished event where the wealthy congratulated themselves for generosity measured in signatures and checks. But to Damien, it had become something else, entirely a battlefield, where he would stand not for profits or reputation, but for the truth he had failed to defend before. The ballroom at the Waldorf glowed with chandeliers, every table crowned with crystal, the stage set with banners of the Blackwood Foundation. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras flashing as gowns shimmered and tuxedos gleamed. Guests whispered about the scandal that still hovered around Damien's name. The rumors that he had fallen for a poor deaf librarian, the grainy photos that had painted her as an opportunist. He could feel their stares but did not flinch. For years he had cultivated the armor of indifference, but tonight he stripped it away. Tonight he would bleed openly before them all. Elena had refused his invitations to attend, but he knew she would be watching. Perhaps from her apartment, perhaps from the back of the room, if courage led her here. Either way, his words would reach her. As the orchestra faded and the host introduced him, Damien walked onto the stage. His figure was tall and commanding beneath the lights, but his expression carried none of the cold detachment people expected. He stood at the podium, scanned the crowd, then deliberately set his notes aside. He lifted his hands, and before speaking a word, he began to sign. The audience shifted murmurs of surprise, rippling across the ballroom. The cameras zoomed in as his fingers moved with precision, his face alive with expression. "My name is Damien Blackwood. My foundation exists to support inclusive education and families living with hearing loss. But tonight I want to tell you why." He paused, his voice finally rising to accompany the signs so that every soul in the room would understand. "When I was 18, my younger brother Adrian died. He was deaf, he was brilliant, he was kind, and he was treated by many as though he were broken. I learned sign language to speak to him, but I did not learn quickly enough. I let others diminish him. I let my father call him a burden. And when he was gone, I carried the guilt that I had not stood tall enough to defend him." Damien's voice cracked the first fracture the public had ever seen in his fortress. But tonight, he continued, "I refuse to repeat my mistake. Recently, I saw a woman treated with the same cruelty, dismissed with the same ignorance, and I realized that silence helps no one." His gaze swept across the room, hard and unyielding now. Deafness is not weakness. It is not brokenness. It is another way of experiencing life, different, not lesser. Elena Ruiz taught me that. She reminded me that dignity is not given by others. It is claimed by those who dare to stand tall when the world tries to bow their heads. Applause began tentatively, at first scattered among the tables, but grew steadily as the weight of his words sank in. Damien did not bask in it. He signed again, his hands deliberate, his eyes unwavering. "To those who mocked her, who mocked anyone for being different, understand this. You are the ones who are blind. Blind to strength, blind to courage, blind to love. Tonight, on behalf of my brother, on behalf of Elena, I stand here to tell you that this foundation will not only write checks. We will build schools where sign language is part of every classroom. We will train teachers, provide hearing aids, create communities where no child will grow up believing they are less." The applause thundered, now many guests rising to their feet, their jewels and silks forgotten as they clapped and wiped tears. Journalists scrambled to record every word flashes, capturing his hands mid-motion, his face unmasked. And somewhere near the back of the hall, half hidden in the shadows, Elena pressed her hand to her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She had come, after all, unwilling but unable to stay away. She had told herself she would not believe him again, not open herself to pain yet, as she watched him bare his soul before the wealthiest and most ruthless in New York. She felt the walls inside her begin to crack. He was not just a billionaire. He was a man who had carried grief and guilt. A man choosing now to use his power not as armor, but as a weapon for those who had none. Damien's speech ended not with grandeur, but with a simple sign, one he held for a long moment: "You deserve better." The words that had begun everything. The room erupted in a standing ovation, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found her, and for a heartbeat their gazes locked. Elna felt as though the world had fallen away, leaving only the truth that this man had stood before 1,000 strangers and declared her dignity as sacred. When the evening ended and the guests flooded out, journalists rushed to declare his speech revolutionary, a turning point not only for his image, but for the conversation about disability rights. Yet Damien did not linger for accolades. He slipped from the stage into the quiet corridors searching. Elena stood near the exit, her coat clutched in her hands, her eyes still damp. For a moment neither spoke, the noise of the gala fading behind them. Then Damien raised his hands and signed slowly, deliberately, each word heavy with truth. "I love you, not despite your deafness, with it, because it is part of you." Elena's breath caught her heart, breaking and healing all at once. She had told herself she could never be enough. But in his eyes she saw no lack, only recognition. The crowd behind them surged with applause, but in that hallway silence reigned. And in that silence Elena felt her soul shift, realizing that sometimes love is not found in fairy tales, but in the courage to stand up when the world expects you to kneel. Elena stood frozen in the dim hallway of the Waldorf, the sound of distant applause echoing faintly from the ballroom. Her coat clutched against her chest like fragile armor. Damien's hands still hung in the air between them, his last sign lingering like a promise. "I love you, not despite your deafness, with it, because it is part of you." She could not move at first, could not breathe, as every memory of rejection, every cruel word she had endured seemed to rise, only to be shattered by the weight of his confession. He did not pity her. He did not see her as broken. He loved her because she was exactly as she was. Her lips trembled as she lifted her hands, afraid and yet unable to stop herself. Why she signed her movements hesitant? Why me? Damien stepped closer, his expression fierce but tender. Because when you smile, it feels like sunlight in a room that has been dark for years. Because you see children not as burdens, but as miracles. Because you remind me of my brother's courage, and because you remind me that my heart is still alive. His voice dropped lower. "Because you are Elena." She swallowed hard tears filling her eyes, but this time they were not tears of shame. They were release long-buried fears breaking open. Slowly she raised her hands again. "I am so afraid," she signed, "afraid it will all collapse, afraid I am not strong enough." Damien's jaw clenched, but his gaze never wavered. "Then let me be strong for both of us, until you believe it too." He reached out, then not demanding, only offering his palm open between them. Elena stared at it, her pulse hammering before she finally laid her trembling hand into his. The moment their skin touched the air seemed to shift. She felt the warmth of him seep into her, grounding her, anchoring her to something she had thought impossible. He lifted her hand, gently pressing it against his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong. "Feel that," he whispered. "It beats for you." She let out a soft sob, the sound breaking free, before she could stop it, and Damien's expression softened with something she had never seen on him before. Peace. He leaned forward, then slowly, carefully, as though giving her every chance to retreat. But she did not. When his lips touched hers, it was not fire or frenzy, but something deeper, a quiet promise, sealed in silence. The kiss was tender, yet certain, a confession, written not in words but in presence. When they finally pulled apart, Elena searched his eyes, finding no trace of doubt, only the steady certainty of a man who had made his choice. She lifted her hands one final time, her movements slow but sure. "I love you too." For a moment, Damien closed his eyes, letting the words settle like balm over years of guilt and loss. Then he opened them again, his voice steady as he said, "Then we begin, Elena. Not a life free from noise or cruelty, but a life together." And for the first time since her childhood, Elena believed that maybe different did not mean broken. Maybe it meant whole, in a way the world had never cared to understand. They left the Waldorf hand in hand, stepping into the cool night, where rain had just begun to fall, the city lights reflecting in puddles like scattered jewels. Paparazzi lurked at a distance, flashes already firing, but Elena no longer flinched. Damien's grip was firm, his presence unshaken, and she realized that as long as they walked together, the noise could never drown out the truth of what they had found. For her love had always felt like something other people deserved. Now she knew it was hers too. Months passed, and the storm that had once seemed unbearable began to fade. Not because the world had grown kinder, but because Elena and Damien had learned to face it together. The gossip columns eventually moved on to fresher scandals, and the noise that once filled her nights with dread became background static she no longer allowed to define her. With Damien at her side, she discovered that strength was not the absence of fear, but the decision to walk forward despite it. The Blackwood Foundation expanded its mission in ways that stunned even its critics. Under Damien's leadership, the foundation launched programs across the country to provide schools with sign language interpreters, donated thousands of hearing aids to families who could not afford them, and sponsored libraries like Elena's, so that every child could see themselves in stories. Elena herself became an advocate reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized that her story carried weight. She spoke at schools, hospitals, and conferences sometimes, with her voice sometimes entirely, with her hands always reminding children and families that different did not mean less. Damien never missed a speech, standing quietly in the back, his eyes steady as she stood tall before crowds who once would have intimidated her into silence. Their love deepened not through grand gestures, but through the quiet routines of life. Saturday mornings became sacred, often spent at the library with children piling into story hour. Damien seated in the corner, pretending not to smile, as Elena's laughter filled the room. Sunday evenings were for dinners in Queens, with her parents who looked at Damien with cautious eyes. At first, but soon recognized the sincerity beneath his wealth. He sat at their small kitchen table with the same seriousness he carried into boardrooms, listening to her mother's stories, eating homemade tamales with a humility that surprised Elena every time. He belonged not because he adapted to her world, but because he chose to honor it. And then came the wedding. It was held at the edge of the ocean on a warm spring day, the sky a soft canvas of blue and gold. Guests arrived from every corner of Damien's life, powerful investors and politicians, mingling with librarians, teachers, and children who had once learned their first sign language word from Elena. The ceremony was lavish, the flowers cascading in white and crimson, the strings of violins mingling with the crash of waves. Yet the grandeur was not what made it unforgettable. It was the moment when the music paused and a choir stepped forward, their voices rising in a song of love and promise. As they sang, interpreters signed every lyric their hands, moving in harmony with the melody. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, every guest raised their hands and joined in signing the words together, an entire sea of people shaping the song, not only with sound, but with silence. Elena's breath caught tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked around at a world she had once thought would never embrace her. Damien reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her skin, and whispered so only she could hear, "This is your song." She turned to him, her heart overflowing. "Our song," she signed back, because none of it would have existed without him standing beside her. The vows they spoke were simple but seared into memory. Damien's voice trembled as he signed and spoke at once, promising not to erase her silence, but to share it, to honor it, to build a life where words and hands spoke equally. Elna's voice broke as she replied, promising to love him, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had chosen to see her worth when the world refused. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause rose both in sound and in silent waves of hands lifted high. They kissed beneath the arch of flowers, the ocean wind sweeping around them, and for Elena it felt like the beginning of everything she had once thought impossible. In the months that followed, their home became a haven of laughter and purpose. The penthouse no longer felt cold. It was filled with warmth, with books she had carried from her apartment, with evenings spent signing stories across candlelight. Damien expanded the foundation further, establishing scholarships for deaf students, building community centers, ensuring that his brother's memory lived not in grief, but in opportunity for others. Elna continued her work at the library, refusing to give up the place that had shaped her even as her role grew larger in the advocacy world. Together they traveled not for luxury, but to learn from communities across the globe, meeting children whose eyes lit up at the sight of someone who understood their silence. Every night when they returned home, Damien would sit with her on the terrace overlooking the city. Sometimes they spoke, other times they signed in silence, their hands weaving conversations that belonged to them alone. And on certain nights when the stars burned brighter and the air felt still, Elena would remember that rainy evening at the Skyline restaurant, the humiliation that had once felt like the end of everything. Now she understood it had been the beginning, because sometimes cruelty clears the path for truth, and sometimes the worst night of your life opens the door to the best one. She rested her head against Damien's shoulder on those nights, whispering the words that had become their promise. Love does not need words to be heard. He would sign back, different does not mean broken, perfectly unique. And together they built a life that was not perfect in the way magazines once demanded, but perfect in its own truth, a testament to the power of seeing worth where others refused to look. It was not the fairy tale Elena had imagined as a girl. It was better because it was real. And it was only the beginning. If you stayed with Elena and Damien until the very last moment, then you already know this was never just a story about a blind date gone wrong, or a billionaire who happened to be watching from the corner of a room. It was about the collision of humiliation and hope, about the way one cruel word can shatter a heart, and how one simple sign, "You deserve better," can stitch it back together again. Maybe as you listened, you felt the sting of Elena's shame like it was your own. Maybe you remembered a time when someone made you feel small, when the world looked at you and decided you were less than when you wanted to vanish into the background because it hurt too much to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, you also felt the rush of warmth when Damien refused to let her sit alone in that pain, when he chose to stand up, not with power or money, but with his hands, with the language of love that needs no sound to be heard. That is what makes this story more than romance. It is a mirror, a reminder that every one of us deserves someone who will look past the noise, past the judgment, past the differences the world calls weakness, and say, "I see you, I choose you exactly as you are." If it made you ache, if it made you cry, if it made you believe, even for a second, that love can bloom in the unlikeliest of places, then I want you to hold on to that feeling, because it means your heart is still open. It means your story is still waiting for its next chapter. Share this video with someone who has forgotten their worth, with someone who thinks they will never be loved, because they are different, with someone who needs to be reminded that different does not mean broken, it means perfectly unique. And if you are that someone, then let this story be your sign. You deserve better. You deserve love that does not flinch at your silence, that does not run from your scars, that does not measure you against impossible standards, but instead whispers you are enough, always enough. So tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if this story touched your soul, tell me how, because I want to know how far Elena and Damien's journey traveled. I want to know if it reached the places in you that needed healing too. And before you go, remember, these fairy tales are not about glass slippers and castles. They are about courage, about choosing love when fear says run, about choosing to believe that somewhere out there, someone is waiting to sign the words you have longed to hear. You deserve better. And sometimes better is already on its way to you.